On October 14th, 1887, dawn reached Elkhorn Crossing as a thin copper line above the cottonwoods, and the mercury in the freight yard thermometer held at 21 degrees, while black water moved beneath skins of shore ice that cracked like split crockery. The settlement counted 312 souls by the church ledger, most of them tied to the ore road that ran south toward the mines and north toward the rail spur, and all of them dependent on one passage over the Black Alder River, a channel known to hold winter ice thick as cut stone, and then, in spring breakup, climb 11 feet in 6 hours when mountain melt and jammed flows arrive together. Wagons, mail, medicine, payroll, and flour crossed there. So did grief and news. Elkhorn had been founded only 9 years earlier, and like many young frontier towns, it had built first for traffic and profit, then planned to learn the river later. Cain Fisher lived above that crossing on a shallow gravel bench east of town, where willow, sedge, and coarse reed grass grew in long, wet bands, and where shallow floodwater stood each thaw season like polished pewter. Men who bought broad lots on higher ground called the bench worthless because it would not hold a fine house, and because spring left driftwood caught in the brush like bones in a net. Cain paid little attention to such judgments. He was 58, broad-shouldered despite a lean face weathered by wind and smoke, with hands marked by trap wire, all work and years of winter cutting. He had come west in stages after the famine winters along the North Baltic had broken his first prospects and scattered his kin, crossing through Dakota with trap bundles, iron tools, and a slate board wrapped in oilcloth. By the time he reached Montana Territory, he had already buried one horse, lost 2 trapping partners to exposure in separate years, and learned to measure safety not by comfort, but by margin. His mother's brothers had taught him in a country where thaw and freeze traded places without warning, where river crossings that stood proud in fair weather failed without ceremony under moving ice. One uncle, Matty, had shown him how rawhide, tightened in cold, could hold as faithfully as forged straps if laid with discipline and kept from rot. The other, Eero, had shown him that rigid frames often died first when shock struck from odd angles. They had built fish weirs, sled runners, and field bridges from what the land allowed, then tested each piece by weight and weather before trusting life to it. Matty had died during a late winter crossing when a plank bridge snapped under mixed current and ice thrust. Eero lasted longer, then succumbed to fever after a trapping season in flooded marsh. Cain kept both men in his methods, not in speeches. He carried their instruction as measurement, sequence, and restraint. That autumn he spoke little about what he intended. He sorted long bones by size beneath a lean-to, scraped them clean, and stretched fresh hides on pegged frames to cure in the dry wind off the flats. Boys hauling coal slowed to stare from the cart track, and women at the public pump traded guesses about whether he meant to build a fish rack, a winter fence, or something stranger. Cain kept working. By the second week of November, Cain had begun walking the banks at first light with a willow rod marked in inches, taking Rawhide at 4 fixed points and scratching the figures into his slate before transferring them to a ledger page each evening by lamp. He watched geese lines and noted their timing. He cut open old beaver dams and measured repair height against prior years. He drove test stakes into the lower bar and returned after each cold snap to see which ones twisted, which held, and which sheared when ice skim pressed along the margins. These habits did not impress the freight yard men, who preferred stronger claims spoken quickly. Yet no one in Elkhorn tracked the river with comparable regularity. The town carpenter, Amos Trindle, watched Cain drag lodgepole poles to the bench and announced in front of the general store that Fisher had gone to carrion work at last, since no sane builder chose flood gravel and animal remains over sawn timbers and iron fasteners. Laughter followed because social agreement arrived cheaply in a new town, where status rested on visible prosperity. Kane passed with a coil of line over one shoulder and answered only once, when Trindle pressed him again beside the hitch rail. "Let them talk," he said, setting his tool crate down to retie the strap. "Words do not alter spring current." He lifted the crate and walked on. Chief Survey Engineer Horace Pemberton arrived before month's end, riding in from St. Louis with a federal letter of recommendation in a leather case and polished boots that took dust badly. He was younger than Kane by more than 2 decades, trained in Eastern drafting offices, exact in speech and confident in formulas copied from river projects where flood rose broad and slow. He had been sent to inspect crossings and propose improvements for freight reliability across 3 territorial routes. In Elkhorn, he found a high timber trestle built to wagon standards, not ice load standards, and declared it serviceable through winter if properly maintained. Then he rode out to the bench, studied Kane's peg templates and stacked long bones curing in shade racks, and named the half-finished work Fisher's Folly in a voice pitched for witnesses. Kane did not dispute the title. He asked only whether Pemberton had measured underside rot in spring ice where current warmed first. Pemberton replied that proper engineering did not rely on trapper superstition, and rode back to town before dusk. By December, the nickname had fixed itself in ordinary speech. Teamsters said they had passed the Folly on their way to Lodore sacks. Children pointed from the bank and called it the Bone Road. Merchants smiled when they said it, but they said it often, which meant they watched it. On January 3rd, 1888, with noon temperature at 9 degrees and a hard west wind pressing smoke flat across the settlement, Kane began the first full span assembly on cribbed stone footings set low to reduce ice sail. The bridge plan measured 64 feet between principal anchors, with a deck width of 6 feet 8 inches, enough for single-file foot traffic, hand carts, and stretcher passage, not wagon teams. He laid paired lodgepole stringers peeled to sapwood, each 7 inches in average diameter, then fitted rib members made from selected elk and bison, long bones cut, boiled, scraped, and sleeved in tarred canvas to seal pores against wet rot. Each bone member was bored to accept white oak pegs, hand-turned to taper. He purchased the oak in 2 shipments at $18 total, bought tar at $11.40, and traded $63 in prime winter pelts for line, nails, and salt. Additional costs came in tallow, ash, and hired lifting labor, bringing the project ledger to $143.60. He built not for appearance, but for controlled movement. Greenhide lashings cut to 1-inch strips, soaked first in warm brine, then in a weak ash lye rinse, were wrapped wet around joints in crossed patterns that distributed force along 3 axes rather than 1. Kane counted wraps aloud while a hired hand marked each completed tie with charcoal. 24 wraps on primary joints, 16 on secondary braces, 12 on rail lashings. After binding, he warmed the joints near covered braziers, so fibers would begin shrinking before nightfall. By morning, each lashing had tightened drum hard. He tested deflection using weighted sand panniers hung at quarter-span points and recorded dip to the nearest half-inch. Where dip exceeded planned tolerance, he doubled the diagonal ties and trimmed brace angles by awl and mallet until load response matched his table. 3 days passed before Pemberton returned with 2 assistants, a survey chain, and a notebook ready for public embarrassment. He asked Kane for permission to stage a demonstration with ore sled weight on the unfinished section, not as a cooperative test, but as a verdict. Kane granted permission on condition that crossings be limited to 1 sled at a time, and that observers stand clear of line recoil. The engineer accepted with visible impatience. Under weight, the span dipped, groaned through hide and wood, and recovered to within 1.25 inches of neutral line. It did not crack. It did not throw pegs. The witnesses did not cheer, because vindication had not yet become a social possibility in Elkhorn, and because a structure that survived by flexing offended every rigid expectation Pemberton carried in his leather case. By the end of February, Kane had set rail lines, anchor ropes, and 2 lantern posts for night signaling, then stacked spare hide coils and tar cloth in a low cache house banked with sod and stone behind the bench. He continued to log river marks at dawn and dusk. He continued to watch geese and beaver work. He continued while the town waited for spring and trusted the high trestle, because it looked substantial from a distance. The bridge on the bench stood lower, stranger and less admired, its ribs dark under canvas sleeves and its lashings drawn tight as clenched hands, ready for a season that had not yet shown its full intent. Late February held a deceptive calm over Elkhorn Crossing. Kane Fisher finished the last rail pegs on his low bench span, checked the cottonwood anchors, trimmed lantern wicks, and stacked reserve lashings in the sod and stone cache house, while the black alder moved under a skin of dull ice that looked settled only at a distance. Each dawn he walked from the gauge stake to the beaver cuts and back, riding river height, wind, crust thickness, goose lines, and dam repairs on his slate before copying entries to ledger by lamplight. Town talk did not soften with the work. At Trindle's hitch rail the bridge remained carrion work, and at Dunleavy's counter men still repeated Fisher's folly with the easy confidence of a borrowed judgment. Kane answered none of it. He kept counting raps, testing knots, and timing flex recovery against the marked post by the east approach. The first week of March brought Chinook breath across the drifts. Snowbanks sweated by noon, froze hard again by dusk, and opened rutted channels down Front Street. Kane noted a pattern he did not like. Under ice flow strengthening before surface breakup, then short evening locks that trapped pressure rather than releasing it. On 2 successive mornings he watched geese pass low in split formations, not the high, clean lines he expected for a stable thaw. At the Willow Reach he found fresh beaver work built higher than his November notch by nearly a handspan. He measured, wrote and recalculated load intervals for emergency crossing, then spent an evening rechecking every major node where bone met lodgepole stringer, palms moving over tarred canvas sleeves and brined greenhide, as if reading a language by touch. By mid-March, with road mud deepening and wagoners cursing their hubs, Kane carried his slate and ledger to the freight office and asked for council floor. Mayor Harlan Pike sat with carpenter Amos Trindle, merchant Caleb Dunleavy, and chief survey engineer Horace Pemberton around the pine table, scarred by ink and freight hooks. Kane reported without ornament. Geese 2 weeks early. Beaver dams over Prior Mark. Dawn sound shifting from top crack to underside grind. Then he laid out sequence and numbers. False warm rain. Channel lift. Hard return freeze. Breakup into moving slabs striking rigid pilings broadside. At 32 degrees with rain, crust softens while constricted current accelerates beneath. At a drop below zero, fresh lock ice stores pressure until release. The first release would not be the largest. The second would carry the force. Pemberton listened with his chin tipped up and one finger on the federal recommendation letter folded in his case, then answered as though correcting a school recitation. The trestle had stood accepted wagon loads and passed 2 winters. Anecdotal weather lore did not constitute engineering method. Territory approval already existed for an iron truss at $2,900. Work to begin after runoff when proper crews and riveted sections could arrive. Pike asked if immediate reinforcement was necessary. Pemberton said no. Dunleavy asked whether town credit should continue for unconventional materials while official work was pending. Pemberton said extending credit for rawhide lashings and animal remains invited panic buying and public confusion. No formal vote followed. It did not need one. Before supper, Dunleavy posted a note refusing further credit for Kane's hide, tar, and salt purchases. That evening, with sleet starting fine as ash and the yard turning to glazed ruts, Kane led 2 winter steer to the skinning frame behind his shed and worked by lantern. Those animals had been reserve against deep cold and sickness. Now reserve became structure. He lifted hides in long, warm sheets, split them to 1-inch and 1 1/4-inch strips by joint clasp, and marked bundles with charcoal numerals matching his lashing table. A barrel took first wash with river water and wood ash. After rinsing, strips went to measured salt brine so fibers would swell evenly before wrapping. He recorded quantities, defects, and shrink expectations line by line. He paid $3.20 cash for extra salt from a ranch hand carrying a private sack off the South Trail, then settled the remainder in labor and pelts already promised. The next day and the day after, the weather swung harder. Meltwater ran in brown threads at noon and snapped to glass at dusk. Kane and 2 hired hands rotated in 4-hour blocks, boring replacement bone members for tapered oak pegs and renewing lashings at nodes designated as sacrificial flex points. The method offended orthodox preference because it treated movement as design rather than defect. Each major joint took paired greenhide bands in opposed spirals, 24 wraps clockwise, 24 counterclockwise, finished wet, driven flat under a hardwood key. As night temperatures dropped, the hide shrank into a gripping collar that could take shock, loosen by fractions under peak strike, then retighten as strain passed. Kane verified behavior with loaded ore sleds, 1,280 pounds on the first pass, 1,640 on the second, measuring mid-span drop and rebound by lantern shadow against the stake. Dip, rise, settle. Line held within 1 3/4 inches. On the evening when the post rider from Granite Falls reached the west approach with federal payroll packets sealed in wax, the trestle was speaking in hollow booms through thaw light. He rode onto the first bents, felt vibration rise through the horse, and turned back before midspan. At the telegraph shack, he made a plain statement that ran through town in minutes. He would not risk horse, mail, or government funds on a bridge sounding like that. Elkhorn missed payroll by 1 shipment and felt the gap at once. Mine owners issued partial scrip where coin was short. Dunleavy limited flour to 1 sack per household. Doorway talk shifted from mockery to arithmetic. Rain followed in a cold, even sheet. Then temperature dropped from the mid-30s to single digits by dark. Margins locked while center current stayed black and fast. Kane slept in short intervals beside his ledger, rose before dawn, and walked the gauge in lantern light. He added downstream drift notes to his crossings protocol, set spare lifeline coils at both approaches, and checked lantern posts twice nightly. Pemberton appeared with assistance for another public loading and put his tallyman at the rail with a survey rod. The crowd came because ridicule had become routine, and routine demanded fresh theater. Under a third pass with wet sand sacks added to mimic live shift, the deck settled deeper, then rose in stages as tension redistributed down the ribs. Pemberton announced that any structure requiring movement to survive had confessed weakness. Trindle repeated the line at sunset to approving laughter. Even so, no one had forgotten the payroll rider turning back from the trestle. By the time March gave way to April, Elkhorn was living in hourly weather instead of seasonal weather. One night, rain tapped steadily on plank roofs. Next morning, the church thermometer stood at -18 in brittle blue light. The black alder carried pressure in a silence that made men pause mid-sentence outdoors, listening without admitting they were listening. Near midnight, a crack rolled from upstream like timber, splitting in sequence. Ice jam, then release. The first surge hit West Bank sheds before the alarm bell finished its second pull. lifting pilings, rolling feed barrels, and tearing gangway planks from braces. The high trestle took direct impacts at mid-bent, shed guard timbers, and lost deck sections in minutes. Lanterns flashed across spray and blowing shards. When the immediate noise passed, Elkhorn stood as two settlements staring at each other over moving black water and grinding white slabs. Wagons could not cross. Teams could not ford. Mineside held grain and little medicine. Townside held the doctor and little flour. Dawn did not bring calm, only accounting. Marta Klein, seamstress and widow of a sawyer, had attempted before first light to carry quinine by bank ice near the willow cut. The crust broke beneath drift cover, and men with poles from shore could not reach her in time. Along the east approach, two freight yard adults had gone out in the dark to reset a loose plank gangway when a floe struck from below and rolled the section loose. Only after daybreak headcount did they report that Thomas Reed, 12 and proud of helping at the yard, had been with them and never made it back from the attempt. Pastor Eli Barrow kept families in the church through the night around the stove after home flues iced over. When wind forced backdraft through a cracked pipe, smoke filled the nave before doors could be forced against drift, and he did not survive inhalation. By mid-morning, no one in Elkhorn spoke about carrion work. Kane had already shifted from prediction to traffic control. He set cottonwood anchors deeper at both approaches, rigged upstream and downstream lifelines to rail posts, and posted crossing intervals on slate, 6 souls at a time in calm, 4 under active ice strike, no handcarts during impact runs. Lantern code followed one-way flow after dark. Lila Barrow arrived breathless on the bench path asking for rope and passage. 5 households had under 2 days of flour, and a woman in labor waited across the cut channel. Kane gave sequence, not comfort. Rope team positions, rail hand order, cadence count, pause points at rib joints 2 and 5. She took instructions and ran them back downslope. Before noon, Pemberton came up from the river edge with frost crusting his collar and river mud up his coatum. His instrument sheet had been torn from blocks and found downstream, chains fouled, transit gone, drafted truss plans reduced to pulp between stones. He stood a long moment by Kane's east post, looking from the lifelines to the moving jam, then to the slate in Kane's hand. Kane gave him another slate and a chalk nub. Stand at east post. Mark crossings and load spacing, so panic doesn't do what water started. Pemberton opened his mouth as if to object, closed it, and took position without reply. Through that day and into the next cold night, he called intervals in a voice stripped of ceremony, while Kane and 2 rope teams belayed each crossing. Mothers came first with children tied into coat belts. Miners crossed with flour sacks on shoulder yokes. A laboring woman crossed on a door plank carried by 4 men stepping to Kane's cadence against the rail. Each impact from upstream sent a shudder through bone, hide, and lodgepole. Each time the span dipped, redistributed, and rose. The movement no longer read as oddity. It read as survival mathematics made visible. By lantern light, the bridge looked less like defiance than comprehension. And the town that had mocked it watched in disciplined silence, counting with the man they had called foolish, until the far bank answered each count with another safe landing. The far bank answered each count with another safe landing, and Kane shifted at once from emergency passage to sustained operation, because a bridge that survived one night under impact could still be lost to fatigue if every crossing drained the same joints. He sent 1 rope team to rest by the cache wall for 30 minutes, sent the second team to heat brine in an iron kettle, and knelt at rib joint 3 with a lantern held low, running his thumb along the edge of each greenhide band to feel for lifting fibers. Where the hide had polished smooth from friction, he marked a chalk line. Where a wrap had begun to feather, he cut it free, drove a fresh strip under the oak key, and called rap counts aloud for Pemberton to record. 24 primary, 16 secondary, 12 rail. No variance. By noon, he had revised the crossing interval from 6 minutes to 8 during active strike, and the longer cadence reduced rebound amplitude by nearly half an inch at midspan. Pemberton wrote every number as Kane gave it, his glove off despite the cold, so chalk would not skip on slate. The federal engineer, who had arrived with polished boots, now stood with boots soaked to the welt, hair uncombed, and coat torn at one cuff where he had caught a spike in the dark. He asked for method, and Kane gave method without decoration. Shock did not break one member alone. It walked the frame seeking the stiffest point. Therefore, no point could remain rigid under load. The lashings must take first blow, the bone sleeve second, the pole third, then release in sequence and return. Pemberton repeated the order back, and Kane nodded once. That exchange did not erase old injury, yet it established working grammar between two men who had spent months speaking from opposing worlds. By late afternoon on April 4th, the bench above the crossing had become a disciplined yard rather than a refuge of chance. Kane set stakes at both approaches and divided traffic by mark. Red cloth for outbound flour, blue cloth for inbound medicine, plain rope for water casks. He designated 2 pause points on the deck where carriers were required to stand still for a 3 count, while rope teams adjusted slack. Lila Barrow, face gray from exhaustion and wind, took charge of the waiting line and repeated Kane's commands in a voice that cut through panic. Children were tied to elders by waist cord. Lanterns were trimmed before dusk and again at midnight. No one crossed without rail contact. No one argued the sequence twice. The work continued through that night and through the next morning, and it grew more technical with each hour, because necessity forced precision on souls who had once mistaken precision for pride. Kane sent for every sound hide in town, paid where he could, and where he could not. He entered names in his ledger under debt to be settled after road opening at fair rate. Dunleavy, the merchant who had refused credit under Pemberton's advice, arrived with 3 bundles from his own storeroom and set them down without comment. Kane weighed each strip by hand, sorted by thickness, and told him which were fit only for secondary braces. Dunleavy, accustomed to setting terms behind a counter, stood waiting for rebuke. None came. He left with empty hands and returned an hour later carrying 2 sacks of salt on a handcart, then stayed to shovel coals under the brine kettle until dawn. Near sunrise, Trindle appeared with a carpenter's kit and a jaw set hard enough to show the old defiance. He had mocked the bridge longest and loudest, and habit still rode him. He examined a scar at the downstream rail and declared it should be fixed by iron strap and spike at once. Kane answered in the same even tone he used to call crossing counts. Iron will hold that point rigid. The next strike will break the member beside it. Hide and key, not spike. Trindle said the sentence was nonsense and reached for his hammer. Pemberton stepped between them before Kane moved, not with anger but with professional authority finally redirected. "You will do as ordered on this span," he said. "Record has already shown why." Trindle held still a long moment, then lowered the hammer and took the brine brush Kane handed him. By the evening of April 5th, organized mockery had collapsed into organized labor, yet its memory remained close enough to sting. Men who had laughed at carrion work now warmed Rawhide by the same braziers and kept their eyes on the raps they had once called primitive. Women who had crossed the bench to avoid speaking with Kane now stood shoulder to shoulder at the cash door, cutting willow toggles and counting ration sacks. When fatigue loosened discipline, old speech returned in flashes. A teamster muttered that no honest bridge should groan like an animal. Kane did not answer. He tapped the rail and told the next group to wait through one impact cycle. The groan came. The deck dipped, and the rail rose again under their hands. The teamster crossed in silence. Not all resistance ended with one lesson. 2 mine clerks from the West Bank attempted at dusk to carry a loaded art chest across out of sequence, arguing that payroll records mattered more than flour. Lila barred their path and called for Kane. The clerks appealed to Pemberton, invoking rank and office. Pemberton looked from the chest to the moving ice, and then to Kane's chalkboard. "This crossing is under Fisher's schedule until further order," he said. "If you break interval, you end all passage." The clerks cursed their delay but yielded the chest, and Kane had the contents divided into 4 lighter sacks before permitting movement. Social hierarchy had not vanished. It had been forced to pass through a narrower gate, one where river law outranked reputation. That afternoon, Kane also began reinforcing the approach works because a bridge could survive center strike and still fail at entry if banks sloughed under repeated traffic. He drove 6 fresh lodgepole deadmen into the east slope at 4-foot spacing, cross-braced them with willow fascines packed in gravel, and belayed the main line through a doubled cottonwood bollard sunk 3 feet into frozen ground. He set a drift fence of scrap plank upriver to shear floating debris off the approach lane and ordered all loose lumber stacked above flood mark. Costs were spoken and written in front of witnesses. $11 for new poles from a ranch lot, $2.40 for rope salvage, $5 promised to any hand who worked night anchor detail. No hand refused. Hunger had narrowed choice, but purpose had widened effort. During a brief lull after midnight, Kane walked alone to the upstream gauge with lantern hooded and slate under his coat. The river gave him signs he recognized from colder countries and from years no ledger in Elkhorn had kept. Frazzle ice began to gather not in broad mats but in narrow, spinning seams, which meant subsurface velocity had increased while surface drift appeared calmer. The low cottonwoods clicked against one another in uneven rhythm, and that rhythm, once counted, showed pulses arriving closer together than on the previous night. He knelt at stake 2 and measured a rise of 3 inches in less than 1 hour, despite falling air temperature. Such rise in cold indicated backing pressure upstream. He scratched the figure into slate and returned at once. At first light on April 6th, with thermometer reading 7 degrees and a brittle wind from the northwest, Kane called Pike, Pemberton, Trindle, Dunleavy, Lila, and Dr. Wynne to the cache wall, and gave warning as plainly as he had given warning in March. The first surge had spent the obvious weakness. The next would test accumulated strain. Upstream jam was building again, likely against the basalt pinch 2 bends north. If it failed at night, current would come black and fast under floating white plates. He ordered non-essential traffic halted by dusk, instructed every household near low banks to move bedding and food above the freight yard line, and directed that 3 infants, the laboring mother and all elders unable to walk quickly, be relocated to the earth-bermed cache before full dark. Pike asked whether that level of caution might spread fear. Kane answered with numbers: river rise, strike interval, temperature swing, and bracewear at node 5. Fear was already present. Order was the only variable left. Pike hesitated, looking toward town where routine still tempted the tired, then gave authority at last. Bell signals were posted at church and freight yard. 2 pulls for crossing pause, 4 for shelter move. Dunleavy unlocked his back room and issued flour by Kane's roster instead of account standing. Trindle took 6 men to move stove coal uphill. Pemberton rewrote the crossing slate in a cleaner hand and added load spacing marks copied from Kane's ledger. The community that had once treated warning as embarrassment now treated it as instruction, though some did so with clenched pride and some with open relief. Through the day, the bench filled with purposeful motion. Women laid pallets in the cache house between stone bins, kept near 52 degrees by packed sod and earth mass. Dr. Wynne prepared boiled cloths and laudanum at measured doses for the laboring mother, then checked each lantern for steady burn. Kane inspected the sacrificial side brace on the downstream quadrant and marked a hatchet line at the point where, if forced, it could be severed cleanly to permit controlled yaw rather than catastrophic snap. He showed the mark to Pemberton and made him repeat the condition under which it must be cut. Only if center strain exceeded rebound limit and debris lock formed at rib 4. Pemberton repeated every word. By late evening, clouds had lowered over the valley in a hard, dark lid, and the river noise changed from scattered knocks to a continuous grinding mutter that carried through ground and timber alike. Kane cut crossing capacity to 4 souls, then to 2, then halted non-essential movement entirely. Lila brought the final household count to the east post. 23 sheltered on the bench, 12 waiting west for morning if morning held. The laboring mother was inside with Dr. Wynne and 2 women from the church circle. Infants slept wrapped in quilts near the warm wall. Outside, rope teams took position at belay points with gloves off for better feel. Pemberton stood at the downstream line where Kane placed him, both hands on tension, eyes fixed on the black lane under the lantern light. Kane listened once to the upstream dark, then gave the order that governed all remaining hours. No one crossed without his count. No one crossed without his count. And for nearly 2 hours the count held against a river that seemed to gather its will in the dark. Lantern light moved in short arcs along wet rails. Rope fibers creaked under gloved hands. The mutter from upstream thickened into a continuous grind, then into separated blows that reached the bridge through water first and timber second, each blow arriving like a delayed answer to a question no one wished to ask aloud. At 2:10 after midnight on April 7th, the answer came in full. The jam at the basalt pinch failed with a report like quarry stones splitting, and a black surge rolled down the channel carrying fence rails, barrel staves, dead stock, and whole cottonwood trunks that turned in the current like thrown spears. The first impact struck the downstream quarter and drove the span 3 feet offline. The second rode higher, slammed the rail, and pinned debris against rib 4 until the deck shuddered under locked force. Kane did not raise his voice. Off-center span. Rope teams hold. Everyone else to east abutment now. Bodies moved because command had replaced argument in Elkhorn. Lila pulled 2 mine hands clear by the sleeves. Dunleavy stumbled on a wet plank and recovered against the rail. Pemberton kept both hands on the downstream belay where Kane had placed him, then saw the trapped debris levering the deck toward a rigid break and lunged for Trindle's dropped hammer and a pouch of spikes, intending to nail the scarred brace back to line. Kane crossed 3 steps through spray and caught his wrist. No iron. Cut line only. Pemberton stared at him through sleet and lantern smoke. If we lose that brace, we lose the span. If we keep it rigid, we lose it now. The river struck again. Kane released Pemberton, drew his hatchet, and chopped through the marked sacrificial side brace at the chalk line he had prepared in daylight. The severed member dropped clear. The locked debris shifted, and the deck yawed downstream by a controlled angle, ugly to the eye and correct to the load. The bridge dipped so far that rail tops kissed black water, then rose by inches as strain redistributed through bone sleeves, hide collars, and pine stringers working in sequence. The walls held. The line held. For the next 40 minutes, the crossing became a machine of breath, rope, and arithmetic. Kane called intervals over impact noise. Pemberton repeated them. Trindle and 2 ranch hands took the upstream belay, feeding slack on Kane's signal and snatching it back at rebound. Dr. Wynne and churchwomen moved the last non-essential souls off the approaches and into the earth-bermed cache house, where stone bins and packed sod kept the interior near 52 degrees, despite wind that drove outside temperature to -6 by the freight yard thermometer. A cottonwood trunk hit the west approach fence and exploded it into splinters. A section of Dunleavy's rear store platform tore free and spun under the bridge, taking with it 2 flour barrels that had been his winter reserve. Pike watched from the east post as the town's highest-built structures failed in sequence. Freight shed doors ripped away, smithy lean-to collapsed, and the mayoral record's chest floated from its brick footing and vanished in churn. Pemberton's status failed with his property. His chain case was already gone to mud. Now his authority survived only where it passed through Kane's instructions. By 3:20, the major pulse had moved through, but secondary strikes continued as broken ice and timber arrived in bands. Kane ordered no crossings. He sent Lila to the cache with a revised count, sent Trindle and Dunleavy to reset approach stakes above New Scour, and kept Pemberton on downstream tension until first light silvered the flood edges and revealed the span still standing, scarred, sagged, and serviceable, while the high timber trestle upstream had become a line of broken bents and dangling planks. Morning brought no relief, only accounting sharpened by hunger. The surge had run for 1 hour and 10 minutes at peak force, then remained dangerous through dawn. Elkhorn was still split. On the west bank, 5 households had less than a day of flour. On the east bank, there was medicine and shelter but little coal. The road north lay under drifted debris and rutted ice. The church bell rope had frozen stiff, and bell signals had to be struck by hand with a hammer wrapped in wool to keep it from cracking in the cold. Grief moved through practical tasks. Marta Klein's brother, Otto, sat outside Dr. Wynne's table with the unopened quinine packet she had tried to carry, and turned it in his hands as if sequence might still be reversed if he held it long enough. He did not weep where others could see. He mended straps and carried water. At noon he asked where her sewing chest had washed, and 3 men went to search the willow snag line, returning with 1 warped drawer and her brass shears tied in silt-stained cloth. At the Reed shack, Thomas Reed's mother pinned his scarf to the interior wall above the stove where he had hung it each evening after freight work, and she measured meal ration by cup as if he might still come through the door asking for the heel of yesterday's loaf. The freight yard men spoke his name in full when they passed tools. They did not shorten it. They did not soften it. A town that had praised his eagerness now kept his place empty on purpose. In the Barrow house, Pastor Eli Barrow's daughter, Leela, worked with a steadiness that resembled him more than any sermon could. She moved cots, recorded names, and carried ash buckets, then stopped only long enough at dusk to fold his smoke-stained collar into a blanket chest and close the lid with both hands pressed flat on the wood. Her mother asked no one for special treatment. She asked for lamp oil and a place near the cache wall where children could sleep away from drafts. By April 8th, after 36 hours of interrupted cold and flood shock, Dunleavy's shelves had changed from abundance display to ration geometry. Beans at the front, salt behind, no sugar visible, flour line measured to the ounce. The merchant, who had once denied Kane credit, now posted weighted allotments by household size and crossed out his own account first. He sent 2 clerks to the bench with ledger pages and told them to copy Kane's distribution marks exactly. Pride had not vanished, but necessity had set it lower than hunger. Late that afternoon, a new crisis formed on the west bank, when roof drift and water weight collapsed the rear wall of the boarding house used by single mine hands. No one died in the fall, but 8 men were trapped by debris and chest-high slush between the boarding house and the collapsed stable, with temperature dropping back toward 4 degrees and wind cutting from the north. They tied a white cloth to a pole and waved from the wreckage, Visible from Kane's east approach through binocular glass Pike had borrowed from a survey crate, Pike looked to Pemberton. Pemberton looked to the broken trestle, then to Kane. This time he crossed the bench path without escort, stopped one pace short of Kane's work table, and removed his gloves before speaking. "I called your method ignorance," he said, voice rough from cold and hours on the rope line. "I said movement was weakness. 8 men are pinned west of the stable with water rising in the drift pocket. Tell me what is required and I will carry it out." Kane held his gaze only long enough to mark that the request had no theater in it. Then he set action in order. 2 rope teams, 1 plank sled, 4 hatchets, no spikes, 50 feet of reserve line, 3 wool blankets warmed in the cache first, so hands would still close after contact with slush. He assigned Trindle to cut a channel through collapsed stable boards, assigned Pemberton to interval tally and West Bank relay, and assigned Lila to hold crossing queue at 0 until rescue loads cleared. "No one moves without count," Kane said. "We bring them by 2s. If the deck takes hard strike, all teams freeze in place until release." Pemberton nodded once and repeated each instruction back, including pause points at ribs 2 and 5. Kane did not ask for apology. He handed him the chalk slate. The rescue ran from 4:35 until full dark. At first crossing, one trapped miner could not place weight on his left leg, so Kane ordered door plank carry with shoulder poles and 4-step cadence to reduce oscillation. At second crossing, a debris pulse hit mid-span and drove spray over the rails. Teams held position by command and completed the carry after rebound. At third crossing, Trindle slipped in slush at the west approach and would have gone under line had Pemberton not locked the belay and dropped to one knee to hold tension until Kane and a ranch hand hauled Trindle back by his coat collar. By the 8th crossing, all trapped men were on the east bank under blankets near the cache wall, hands blistered, faces gray, alive. That night, the laboring mother delivered a daughter inside the warm earth house while wind dragged loose tin along the freight yard, like chain. Dr. Wynn reported both stable by lantern note posted at the door. Souls who had not slept in 2 days sat with backs against stone bins and listened to the infant cry, as if it were proof that sequence, discipline, and mercy still belonged to the same world. Near midnight, Kane and Pemberton made a final inspection of the span with hooded lantern and line hook. The severed sacrificial brace hung where it had dropped, half submerged, doing precisely what it had been cut to do by keeping the remaining frame from taking rigid lock. Kane measured mid-span sag at 3 1/4 inches beyond neutral and wrote it beside watermark and temperature in his ledger. Pemberton copied the figure to his own notebook, then paused at the column header where he had once written folly in a narrow engineer's hand. He struck the word once, not to hide it but to preserve the correction, and wrote Fisher method beneath it. By dawn on April 9th, the river had fallen 7 inches from peak and the strike intervals had widened. Exhaustion settled over Elkhorn like weather, but order held. Crossing resumed at restricted cadence for flour, medicine, and fuel only. Kane opened 2 additional stone bins in the cache and issued smoked venison, barley, and dried turnip by household tally with Pike and Dunleavy, witnessing each entry so debt and gift would not be confused later. No one left empty-handed. No one was turned away for old words. When the morning line shortened, Otto Klein came to the bench carrying Marda's brass shears wrapped in clean cloth. He set them on Kane's table and asked whether there was sewing work needed on torn blankets and coat cuffs for rope teams. Kane pointed him toward the cache door, where Lila had begun sorting damaged wool. Otto went at once and sat beside the Barrow widow, mending in silence while the bridge creaked under measured loads outside. The town had not yet reached reckoning. It had reached dependency, grief, and the first difficult shape of humility. On the river, The span of bone, hide, and pine kept moving with each strike and each step, not beautiful, not proud, but faithful to the force it had been built to meet. Cain treated that faithfulness as a task that had to be renewed each hour. He ordered hot broth at the cash door before dawn, placed Otto Klein with the mending circle, and rotated rope teams by the clock so no hands stayed on wet line past numbness. He gave away smoked venison in strips measured to household size, barley in cloth sacks marked by chalk, and dried turnip from the rear bin that he had packed the previous October when men still laughed at the work. By the evening of April 9th, the contrast between preparation and reputation had become plain even to those who wished it had not. Cain's full ledger for bridge, cash, salt, tar, and reserve food stood at $143.60 for the span, plus winter provisions gathered a little at a time. Pemberton's planned iron truss, priced at $2,900, existed only in washed pulp and memory. The high trestle, built to look commanding above floodline, lay broken in the channel. Cain's low bridge, built to bend, carried flour and medicine under strict count. 3 days later, with ice still running but no major surge, Cain began teaching while the crisis was still active, because he had no use for admiration that did not become skill. He set Trindle at joint repair under supervision and made him speak each step aloud. Warm brine, ash rinse, wrap direction, wrap count, keyed finish, heat set. He put Dunleavy at supply accounting and required him to post true weights rather than rounded favors. He placed Pemberton at mid-span observation with a measuring rod and had him log dip and rebound after every heavy crossing. When measurements varied, Cain halted traffic and corrected lash tension before continuing. Lila Barrow became the bridge figure between households that still carried old anger and households that had already accepted discipline. She carried Cain's slate from post to post, read intervals in a clear voice, and refused every attempt to jump queue, whether by mine foreman, freight clerk, or council relative. Dr. Wynne, seeing fewer cold injuries once order held, moved from emergency care to prevention, inspecting boots and issuing dry cloth at the cache wall. The laboring mother, now with her daughter wrapped near the warm stone, sent her husband to night anchor detail in thanks for shelter. On April 12th, Pike and Pemberton sent a written report by mounted relay to the territorial office at Helena, describing the trestle failure, the emergency crossing protocol, casualty names, and immediate need for rope, oats, and stovepipe. The reply reached Elkhorn 5 days later. Supplies approved, engineering review to follow, no immediate federal crew available until roads fully reopened. The town received the news without surprise. It had already learned that paper moved slower than thaw water. As the second week of April closed, Cain walked the upstream gauge at first light and marked a steady fall. He allowed controlled handcart traffic by April 16th and reopened limited livestock crossing by April 18th, one animal at a time with side guide ropes. On April 19th, ground at the burial plot softened enough to dig. The funerals were held in wind that smelled of wet earth and coal smoke. Marta Elise Klein was named in full, seamstress, widow, sister, who carried quinine for another household when safer souls stayed indoors. Thomas Elias Reed was named in full, age 12, freight helper, who stepped forward into work before his years and was lost when adults misjudged a failing gangway. Pastor Eli Nathaniel Barrow was named in full, shepherd of families, who kept church doors open through the first night of cold and did not survive the smoke that followed. No one rushed the words. No one cut them short. That same afternoon, when tools were stacked and teams fed, Pike called a gathering at the freight yard. Not a celebration, a reckoning. The surviving town stood in a rough semicircle near the damaged loading platform, boots in thaw mud, coats patched with river grit. Kane remained by a wagon tongue, hat in hand, saying nothing while others chose whether to speak. Trindle went first because his mockery had been loudest. He looked older than a fortnight earlier, beard gone gray with ash and sleeplessness. "I called your work carrion work," he said, voice carrying to the rear line. "I told men that no sane builder would trust bone and hide. I mocked what I did not understand, and then I lived because that same work held while mine failed. I cannot ask you to forget those words. I can ask to learn the method I insulted." Dunleavy followed with his ledger under his arm. "I denied you credit for rawhide and salt when I had stock on my shelves. I did it to align with authority and to protect my standing. Then I watched my shelves go bare, while your cash-fed households I had counted as risks. My account books were clean, and my judgment was not. I will settle every debt entered under emergency issue at fair rate, and I will keep reserve stock by your winter table henceforth." Otto Klein spoke without stepping forward. "Marta died carrying medicine because we had no safe crossing when warning was given. I didn't laugh at the bridge, but I did nothing when others laughed. Silence has weight. I carry that as well." Pemberton stood last. Mud stained his coat to the hem. His polished boots were gone, replaced by plain work pairs bought from a ranch hand after the surge. He held a notebook with pages swollen by damp and read from it once, then closed it and spoke without looking down. "I arrived with credentials and formulas that were valid in other rivers and invalid here. I called your knowledge superstition. I named your bridge Fisher's Folly and encouraged policy that blocked your materials. I treated inherited practical method as inferior because it came without institutional seal. The result was measurable harm. 3 named dead, structural failure, delayed response, and avoidable suffering. During the surge at 210 on April 7th, I attempted to force rigidity where controlled movement was required, and nearly cost the span. You corrected me in time. I remained on your line and watched the bridge survive because it bent. I was wrong in public, and I stated in public." He paused, then finished with formal precision. "Kane Fisher, I ask what restitution is proper, and whether there is any form of forgiveness you consider warranted." The yard held still. Even the horses seemed quiet. Kane did not step onto a crate or seek the center. He answered where he stood, in the same working tone he used at the rail. "The dead are beyond speeches. Do not place that burden on words today. Marta Klein is dead. Thomas Reed is dead. Eli Barrow is dead. If there is work that honors them, it is work that changes practice." He set his ledger on the wagon tongue and opened it where river marks, lashing tables, and load intervals filled the pages. "I did not build this bridge for revenge, nor to win a quarrel. I built it because this river behaves as it behaves, whether pride approves or not. Forgiveness, if it exists here, will not be a sentence spoken once. It will be measured in winters." Then he gave terms, plain and enforceable. Mixed crews through summer, apprentices from both banks. No bridge foreman exempt from gauge duty at dawn during thaw season. Every apprentice to learn hide preparation, joint sequence, and current reading by hand and eye. Merchant reserve quotas posted each October. Emergency shelter bins inspected monthly. Crossing authority during breakup assigned by competence, not title. He turned one page and tapped a column with his thumb. "Teaching days will be paid at $6 from the unspent portion of the trust contract. Not to enrich me. To set value on instruction so no one calls it worthless again." Pemberton answered first. Agreed. Pike repeated it for council record. Trindle nodded, jaw tight, then said, "Put me on first crew." Dunleavy asked for a copy of the reserve table before nightfall. Work began the next morning, and it did not soften for comfort. Kane made Pemberton scrape and sleeve bone members beside ranch boys who had never held a survey rod. He made Trindle recut 3 practice lashings that were strong but uneven, because uneven meant unpredictable under shock. He made Dunleavy weigh salt in front of apprentices, so trade and structure stayed tied to the same arithmetic. Lila kept attendance and later taught younger children to read gauge marks carved into the cottonwood post. By the second week of June, the severed sacrificial brace had been replaced with a quick-release assembly designed on Kane's original chalk principle and drawn in Pemberton's clean drafting hand, with full credit to Fisher method flexible lash-joint spans for ice rivers. In July, the revised territorial bridge circular was submitted with both names, and in September a copy returned stamped received and recommended for northern districts where breakup loads exceeded standard wagon assumptions. Years later, Elkhorn Crossing counted 487 souls in the winter ledger. 2 flexible spans served the town. The original low bench crossing, repaired and maintained, and a second mixed-frame bridge downstream built by crews trained from Kane's tables. Children in winter term practiced rap counts on willow frames before they learned formal geometry. Merchants posted reserve figures each October without being asked twice. Survey crews arriving from larger cities stopped calling the design folly. They called it Elkhorn practice or simply Fisher count. Kane Fisher taught until his hands stiffened and his pace slowed. He never requested a monument. The closest thing to one stood at the east approach, where a cedar board carried an inscription carved by apprentices under Lila Barrow's supervision. Build for the river you have, not the river you prefer. The letters were plain, deep cut, and kept oiled against weather. The bridge still stands low over the black alder, scarred, practical, and quiet in thaw light. Each spring the town reads the gauge at dawn. Each spring the town remembers that pride built fast and failed fast, while humble craft shared without vengeance carried strangers home. On April 7, 1889, exactly 1 year after the Black Surge, Kane stood at Gauge Stake 2 with Lila Barrow, Otto Klein, and 6 apprentices holding lanterns against a wet dawn wind. The river sat 19 inches below the prior peak mark cut into cottonwood, yet Frazzle still spun in narrow seams, and Kane made the children count pulses between impacts before he allowed a single crossing. He carried the same slate he had used that night, edges worn white from handling. Pemberton arrived with a new ruled field book, copied Kane's numbers line for line, and read them aloud so the apprentices could hear method before movement. After gauge duty, they walked to the cache house, where every stored item from the disaster had been inventoried, not discarded into sentiment or rumor. The reserve salt sacks denied in March and delivered too late were now stacked by date and weight, each one chalked with issue and refill marks. Marta Klein's brass shears hung at the mending table by Otto's hand, used daily to cut wool strips for rail gloves. The unopened quinine packet she died carrying had been sealed in waxed cloth and placed in a cedar box at Dr. Wynn's request, then brought out each winter term as a lesson in timing, access, and consequence. The severed sacrificial brace, trimmed to show the hatchet line, lay on trestles at the wall so apprentices could touch the split grain and understand why controlled failure had preserved the span. By June of that same year, the territorial office sent 2 additional engineers to inspect the revised circular that credited Fisher method, flexible lash-joint spans for ice rivers. They came by coach in tailored coats, carrying steel calipers and a confidence familiar to Elkhorn. One introduced himself as Edwin Marlowe, the other as Gideon Strake, and both studied the bridge with narrowed eyes before speaking to Pike and Pemberton near the east post. Marlowe called the structure transitional at best and asked why the town had not replaced it with full iron. Strake tapped a bone sleeve with a metal rod, frowned at the hollow note, and said he would not trust livestock to such a deck under spring load. Kane heard every word while sorting greenhide strips in warm brine. He did not answer from a distance. He walked over, set down the bucket, and asked which of them wished to run rebound measurements at midspan in active drift. They accepted, perhaps expecting a staged display. Kane gave them no spectacle, only sequence. At 10:20 in the morning, air temperature 41 degrees, they crossed with rod, plumb line, and 2 weighted grain carts totaling 1,720 pounds. Under first strike, the deck dipped 2 1/8 inches, yawed 1 degree downstream, then returned to within 3/4 of an inch at rest. Under second strike, with debris brushing rail 3, the lashings took load and recovered without peg shear. Pemberton read each figure from Kane's tally board. Lila copied to school slates for younger observers. Trindle checked joint heat with the back of his hand and called out which wraps required wetting. When the run ended, Marlowe removed his gloves slowly and asked to inspect the quick-release assembly that had replaced the cut brace. Strake requested Kane's rap table and did not return the mocking tone he had brought from the coach. 3 days later, at a public instruction held in the freight yard, the reckoning widened beyond those who had spoken the previous April. Pike required every contractor, merchant, and foreman to attend with apprentices present, because he said shame hidden among elders became arrogance in the next generation. Pemberton spoke first and repeated his earlier confession in fuller detail, including the letter he had sent before the flood recommending delay and the credit policy that had blocked Kane's material purchases. Then he produced that letter, now copied into council record, and placed it beside Kane's river ledger on a plain pine table where all could see the difference between authority and attention. Dunleavy stepped forward with his own old refusal notice, the one he had posted against Rawhide credit, and nailed it to the same table. He left it there through the session as evidence, not theater. Not every soul found words. Some offered labor in place of speech, and Kane accepted labor while refusing performance. Amos Trindle, who had once laughed loudest, arrived at dawn for 40 straight days to teach apprentices how to read grain direction in lodgepole so pegs seated true. He told each class exactly what he had said in 1887 and why it had been wrong. 2 mine clerks who had tried to force the ore chest out of sequence brought new ledger forms with crossing weights pre-printed and asked Lila to review them before use. They also admitted in front of the yard that rank had made them careless during danger. Otto Klein did not offer formal apology because his grief had never taken the shape of ridicule. Instead, he opened Marta's sewing account book and created a standing line item for bridge cloth repairs, paid first each month before his own trapping supplies. Action became the town's language of remorse. When Pike asked Kane to close the gathering with a statement on forgiveness, Kane stood with his hat at his side and addressed the apprentices instead of the men who had asked the question. He said his uncles had taught him in Finnish winters that river ice was honest because it did not flatter anyone. It carried what load it could carry and broke where builders lied to themselves. He said Elkhorn had buried 3 named souls because warning had been treated as insult, and that no sentence could repay a mother, a sister, or a pastor. Then he laid out what could still be chosen: daily gauge duty, open ledgers, mixed crews, and the duty to teach methods before disaster, not after. If you seek forgiveness, he said, build so that strangers may cross safely in weather you did not expect. Do that for 10 winters. Then ask the question again. In August 1890, a board of 4 engineers returned to Elkhorn, including Marlowe and Strake, and remained 6 weeks to study joint wear under alternating heat and cold. They paid for board, bought local materials at posted rates, and worked under Kane's supervision rather than around it. The cost books from that season were preserved. $27 for rawhide stock, $14.80 for tar and canvas patches, $9 for white oak blanks, $6 per teaching day to cane as previously set, and $2 per day to each apprentice during flood rehearsal week. The board's final memorandum, filed at Helena on September 18, 1890, noted that flexible lash-joint spans on ice rivers reduced catastrophic failure where rigid pilings faced recurrent jam impact. It cited Elkhorn by name and attached Kane's lashing table as Appendix C. Pemberton insisted on that attachment and would not sign until it was included. By the winter term of 1893, Elkhorn's schoolhouse kept a practical cabinet beside the maps, one bone sleeve section, two keyed hide collars, a peg with proper taper marks, Marta's shears, and a copy of the Surge Night tally written in 3 hands, Kane's, Lila's, and Pemberton's. Children learned to parse those artifacts as civic duty rather than relic. They practiced rap counts on willow frames, then walked to the gauge at dawn in pairs, recording height, drift, wind, and animal signs. Geese shifting early was no longer dismissed. Beaver dams raised above notch were no longer quaint curiosity. Each sign entered the ledger and triggered assigned tasks that had names, hours, and responsible crews. Kane Fisher taught until 1898, when stiffness in his right hand made not finishing slow. On his final instruction day, he handed the chalk slate to Lila Barrow, now winter term instructor and crossing marshal, and asked Pemberton to read the morning marks one last time in the same clear voice he had used on the rope line. Then Kane walked the span at first light, pausing at rib 2, rib 5, and the replaced quick-release brace, touching each rail as a man greets old partners. He died 2 winters later in his sleep, 71 years old, in the sod-banked house above the bench, with his ledger closed and oiled against damp. At the burial, no one spoke of genius or miracle. They spoke of costs, measurements, names, and duties carried forward. The cedar board at the east approach was replaced with stone when weather finally split the wood, and the inscription remained unchanged. Build for the river you have, not the river you prefer. In the present day of that valley, the bridges at Elkhorn still run low and resilient, and each spring at dawn a line of apprentices still gathers at Gauge Stake 2, counting pulses on black water before the first crossing of the day.